Seinfeld never chased greatness, and that is exactly how it found it. No villains, no redemption arcs, just the quiet chaos of four people making every wrong choice with total confidence. But what the cameras never captured was the story that came after. Time moved on and left its mark on every face. Fame rewrote some endings. Loss made certain scenes impossible to watch the same way twice. This is Seinfeld, then and now. And what really happened to the cast when the most iconic comedy on television finally turned off its lights. Jerry Seinfeld anchored the entire show from its opening frame. A stand-up comic playing a heightened, fictional edition of himself. Someone whose world was organized around social precision and minor grievances elevated to matters of principle. Born April 29, 1954, he was 35 years old when the series debuted in 1989, splitting his time between the Comedy Club and Monk's Cafe, where the smallest human behavior could become a case worth arguing. On screen, Jerry operated not on growth, but on control. He pursued relationships, then abandoned them the moment something felt slightly off. A sound, a habit, a breach of unspoken etiquette. His apartment served as the show's nerve center, the place where George's disasters hatched, Elaine's frustrations detonated, and Kramer materialized unannounced. Jerry stood at the center of it all, composed, amused, and fundamentally unmoved. What the series gradually exposed was that this detachment was not a virtue. Jerry was not the moral anchor. He was the primary witness, and over time the show made that role feel quietly damning. The finale translated years of accumulated indifference into legal consequence, small moments of cruelty adding up to something that could no longer be ignored. As of 2026, Jerry Seinfeld remains one of the most recognizable figures in stand-up comedy, still actively defining what observational humor sounds like. George Costanza was the show's most nakedly human creation, a man engaged in perpetual war with his own inadequacies, convinced the universe owed him a better outcome than the one he kept engineering for himself. Jason Alexander, born September 23, 1959, was 30 when the series launched in 1989, and he built George from the inside out, a combustible mix of wounded vanity, creative deception, and an almost heroic capacity for self-sabotage. On screen, George reinvented himself constantly, conjuring fake occupations, fabricated identities, and elaborate lies designed to avoid the humiliation he invariably sprinted toward anyway. He wanted admiration without labor, romance without honesty, and dignity without ever earning it. And yet the performance never alienated audiences because the panic felt too familiar to dismiss. What gave the character its unusual depth was its origin. George was drawn heavily from Larry David's own life, which is why he rarely reads as a comic construction. He reads as exposure, a real set of anxieties and rationalizations rendered in vivid, unflattering detail. Jason Alexander went on to develop a wide-ranging career across stage, screen, voice work, and directing after the show concluded. But George Costanza remains the defining achievement, a portrait of failure rendered so precisely it became something universal. Elaine Benes was the force that made the central group feel complete, sharp, headstrong, and constitutionally resistant to playing a diminished role in any room she entered. Julia Louis-Dreyfus, born January 13, 1961, was 29 when she came aboard in 1990, and she gave Elaine a velocity and specificity that refused to be reduced to simply the woman in the group. Elaine moved through the show's world on her own terms, navigating impossible bosses, rotating romantic disasters, and social situations that unraveled in real time, meeting each one with the same restless energy Jerry channeled into observation and George channeled into panic. She was witty and generous, impulsive and ruthless, and the oscillation between those qualities made her feel genuinely unpredictable. Her physicality, the push, the dance, the withering glance, communicated character in ways that no script alone could achieve. She was never polished into heroism. Her flaws were as visible as everyone else's, and that honesty kept her electric. After Seinfeld, Julia Louis-Dreyfus accomplished something rarely achieved in television. She stepped fully outside an iconic role and constructed an entirely new legacy from scratch, proving the brilliance audiences recognized in Elaine was never circumstantial. Elaine Benes remains proof that the most commanding presence in a room does not always require the loudest voice. Cosmo Kramer was the show's engine of pure, unfiltered chaos. The neighbor who treated Jerry's apartment as an extension of his own living space and arrived with enough kinetic energy to derail whatever calm had briefly settled. Michael Richards, born July 24, 1949, was 40 when the series premiered in 1989, and he built Kramer almost entirely through physical instinct, his body registering reactions before language had any chance to catch up. Every entrance was a performance in itself. Every scheme arrived delivered with total conviction, the certainty of a man who had never once doubted his own unconventional genius. What made it work was not the strangeness of the ideas, but the seriousness with which Richards pursued them. Kramer did not wink at the absurdity. He lived inside it, which gave even the most outlandish moments an odd plausibility. Across 9 seasons, he became the ideal counterpoint to Jerry's measured control. Impulsive where Jerry was calculated, fearless where others hesitated, and weirdly loyal at moments when loyalty was most inconvenient. Michael Richards later withdrew significantly from public life, following a controversy that permanently altered public perception. In 2026, he maintains a notably low profile. Kramer stands as his defining legacy, a creation in physical comedy so precisely assembled that it has never been successfully replicated. Newman was built for maximum comic antagonism, a man who could walk through a door and transform Jerry's expression into something between dread and contempt before a single word had been spoken. Wayne Knight, born August 7, 1955, was 37 when he first appeared as Newman in 1992. And he played the character with the absolute conviction of someone who genuinely believed he was the most important person in any given situation. A postal worker by title, Newman functioned in the world of the show as something grander and more theatrical. A rival with institutional grievances, a schemer with ambitions far exceeding his circumstances, and a friend to Kramer whose combined energies produced plans that were simultaneously absurd and alarmingly coherent. The comedy lived in his self-regard. Newman never experienced himself as comic relief. He experienced himself as a figure of consequence, perpetually overlooked by a world that should have recognized his significance. And that gap between self-perception and reality made every humiliation hit harder. Knight gave the character a magnificent voice, a posture of barely contained self-satisfaction, and a commitment to theatrical indignation that turned a recurring annoyance into one of the show's most beloved presences. After Seinfeld, Knight continued working steadily across film, television, and voice performance. But Newman endures as one of his signature roles, confirmation that a great sitcom antagonist does not need to be evil, only magnificently, hilariously offended by your continued existence. Susan Ross wandered into George Costanza's orbit and quietly became one of the show's most unsettling comic subjects. A woman too reasonable for the world she had entered and too trusting to recognize what that world was capable of. Heidi Swedberg, born March 3, 1966, was 26 when she first appeared in 1992. Beginning as a television executive before gradually becoming the fixed point around which one of the series' darkest ongoing jokes revolved. Susan was measured where George was impulsive, patient where he was petulant, and consistently the most functional adult in any room he managed to destabilize. And yet the more deeply she committed to their relationship, the more clearly the show revealed that her engagement was less a love story than a collision in slow motion. George spent entire seasons engineering exits, and the audience was made complicit in rooting for them. What gave Susan her particular resonance was not broad comedy but contrast. Her rationality made George's selfishness look worse by comparison, not through accusation but simply by existing beside it. Her death from toxic glue on wedding invitation envelopes remains one of the series' most startling moments. Absurd in construction, perfectly cold in execution. Heidi Swedberg stepped away from the center of Hollywood after the series and turned her focus more seriously toward music. Susan Ross endures as the show's most infamous punchline, evidence that in Seinfeld's universe, even an engagement is just another route to disaster. Estelle Costanza arrived in George's storylines like a domestic pressure system that had been building for decades before finally making landfall. Loud, wounded, controlling, and absolutely certain of her own correctness, she transformed every kitchen scene into a psychological event. Estelle Harris, born April 22, 1928, was 64 when she first appeared in 1992, and she made George's home feel less like a place of comfort and more like an environment designed to produce exactly the person he had become. Estelle did not simply nag or worry. She erupted, every sentiment arriving fully pressurized, as if it had been stored at high intensity for years before finding its moment. What gave the performance its extraordinary staying power was what lived beneath the volume. A parent whose love, anxiety, need for control, and accumulated disappointments had fused into a single unstoppable force. Her scenes alongside Frank Costanza became some of the series' most beloved moments precisely because they felt less like sitcom construction and more like the living record of a marriage that had long since moved past diplomacy. Harris brought a voice perfectly calibrated to cut through any scene, and she wielded it with absolute commitment, turning even the most ordinary outrage into something audiences could not forget. She died on April 2nd, 2022, just days before her 94th birthday. Estelle Costanza stands as one of television's most iconic maternal figures, not because she offered comfort, but because she was impossible to look away from. Frank Costanza was a man who treated every minor inconvenience as a personal insult requiring an immediate full-volume response. He did not enter rooms. He occupied them, already primed for conflict, already certain that whatever had happened before he arrived was somehow wrong. Jerry Stiller, born June 8, 1927, was 66 when he took the role in 1993, and he elevated the Costanza household into one of the great pressure cookers in sitcom history. Frank was neither balanced nor predictable. He shouted, accused, nursed decades-old grudges, invented alternative holiday traditions, and turned the smallest slight into a referendum on personal dignity. Yet he never felt like a caricature, because Stiller played him with such complete internal conviction that Frank stopped functioning as a type and became something approaching mythological. Festivus, the manure, the unresolved rages carried forward from eras no one else could quite remember. Frank Costanza generated unforgettable moment after unforgettable moment. His dynamic with Estelle produced the wildest domestic comedy the series ever staged. And in George's full-body panic at the mention of his father's name, the show quietly explained everything it needed to explain about cause and effect. Jerry Stiller died on May 11, 2020, at age 92. Frank Costanza remains among television's finest examples of comic escalation, a man who transformed family into something you survived rather than simply inhabited. Helen Seinfeld loved her son with a completeness that left no room for objectivity. Tender, hovering, and constitutionally incapable of acknowledging Jerry's flaws, she treated him simultaneously as a capable adult in his 30s and as a child still requiring careful protection from the world's harsher realities. Liz Sheridan, born April 10, 1929, was 61 when she first appeared in 1990. And she brought to the role a warmth so genuine, it made even the most suffocating moments feel oddly endearing. Helen operated without Estelle Costanza's volcanic intensity. Her version of control arrived through quiet guilt, persistent hovering, and an unshakable conviction that her son could do nothing truly wrong. Alongside Morty, she formed a smaller comedy unit unto themselves, their scenes anchored by condo politics, retirement-era grievances, and the gentle friction of a long marriage expressing itself in familiar shorthand. What made Helen work as a recurring presence was that she never seemed written for the show. She seemed to have wandered into it from somewhere more sincere, a genuine mother dropped into Seinfeld's selfish universe, warm enough to feel real, even as the world around her refused to meet her at that register. Liz Sheridan died on April 15, 2022, at age 93. Helen Seinfeld remains one of the series' most quietly affectionate recurring figures, proof that even in a world organized around petty self-interest, something resembling real love could still find its way into the frame. Morty Seinfeld was old-world stubbornness, preserved in retirement amber, a father who treated a wallet dispute, a condo board conflict, or an outdated raincoat with the same seriousness he might have brought to matters of genuine consequence. Barney Martin, born March 3, 1923, was 68 when he assumed the role in 1991 following the pilot, and he gave Morty an endearing combination of thrift, wounded pride, and hair-trigger irritability that made Jerry's emotional restraint feel like a clearly inherited trait. Morty lived in a world populated entirely by grievances, principle, and the firm conviction that the battles worth fighting were the ones most people would dismiss as trivial. He was not a soft presence fading gracefully into the background of his son's life. He was still active, still arguing, still fully persuaded that he was right and had always been right. His relationship with Helen generated a warmer, softer strain of Seinfeld comedy than the Costanza household produced, but the underlying stubbornness was always visible just beneath the surface. He loved Jerry, but he also loved prevailing in any argument, and the show understood those two things were not always the same impulse. Barney Martin brought enough genuine weight to the role that Morty always felt lived in rather than performed. He died on March 21, 2005, at age 82. Morty Seinfeld endures as one of the series' great parental forces, a reminder that Jerry's famous cool had roots in a household far noisier and more contested than it suggested. Uncle Leo was the living embodiment of family obligation reimagined as a sudden ambush, the relative who materialized without warning, already wounded by whatever level of enthusiasm had not been provided. Len Lesser, born December 3, 1922, was 69 when he first appeared in 1991, and he gave the character an intensity that made every chance encounter feel like the continuation of an argument that had begun years before the episode opened. The voice carried a permanent note of preemptive grievance. The raised eyebrows communicated both hello and accusation simultaneously. Uncle Leo did not visit. He arrived to conduct an audit. He enlarged every minor slight into a substantial emotional wrong, bragged about Jeffrey at the earliest available opportunity, and operated under the belief that the entire family structure should organize itself around his need to feel sufficiently appreciated. What made him genuinely funny rather than merely exhausting was that he felt authentic in a way that made audiences mildly uncomfortable. Everyone carries a version of Uncle Leo in their lives, the relative who loves loudly, judges immediately, and somehow manufactures guilt simply by entering a space. Lesser played him with enormous energy and complete sincerity, which is exactly why every line registered as a small comic alarm sounding in an otherwise quiet room. He died on February 16, 2011, at age 88. Uncle Leo endures as one of Seinfeld's finest family irritants, evidence that love and annoyance can arrive wearing an identical expression. If this journey through the cast brought back something worth remembering, share which character still makes you laugh hardest and which piece of their story landed in a way you did not expect. Stay connected for more cast retrospectives, because the shows that shaped how we see the world never really finish saying what they came to say.